we all suffer traumatic events in our lives. And for the most part, we recover really well. We bounce back. We feel loved. We feel cared for. We feel that we belong. Perhaps we're very well fed and very well looked after. And it's easy for us to recover from the usual traumatic events that happen most days in most of our lives. And in fact, some people would say that a certain amount of trauma is pretty important in terms of developing character and resilience and developing our immune system and so on. We need those challenges as well. But sometimes we don't recover. There may be circumstances that come up that don't let us recover so easily. We may be hit and injured by somebody we love, somebody that we don't want to blame. We may blame ourselves for such things. We may be traumatized by events when we're essentially unconscious, sleeping in a car, for example, in a car crash, or being born, which is not yet a fully conscious event. So there are many aspects of trauma which we can embody rather than release. And when we hurt in that way, we tend to hold ourselves. We tend to bundle ourselves up in a protective sort of posture. The shocked person who hasn't recovered from that shock, who maybe trembled and everything and then kind of just got down to it and got back to work and really didn't get rid of that shock. Such people may very well hold themselves, protecting themselves, curling up and protecting the middle, protecting the belly, protecting the heart, protecting the throat, for example, all those vulnerable bits. On the other hand, we may find ourselves under threat. And we may, because we feel threatened, go into a natural state of alarm, the fight or flight response. And this too is a survival response. In that situation, if we don't discharge that adrenaline and all of that force, we bottle it up. And it too becomes embodied in us. And we will tend to carry quite an aggressive sort of posture, kind of an angry sort of posture, a hair trigger sort of posture, throughout years even, certainly months. And we come to embody this in the way we live, in the choices we make, the occupations that we take up, our interests, and everything gets shaped by how we embody trauma, if indeed we haven't been able to resolve it. So embodiment is very important in craniosacral therapy, the whole notion of embodiment, how we wrap ourselves up in posture, in attitude, and in our very chemistry in terms of shock and alarm. One of the ways in which we access this embodied trauma is through tuning in to craniosacral motion. Because if there's a close relationship between traumatic embodiment and how that motion influences us, whether it entrains us or not. And when we're fractured by chronic alarm or chronic shock, that cranial rhythm, it beats on, but it finds it very difficult to harmonize the whole of the rest of the body because of the way we're carrying ourselves. It keeps plugging away and trying to synchronize us in a reasonable pattern. Day and night pattern, thirst and hunger patterns, all the patterns that are part of everyday life may feel completely out of sync. Sleep will be destroyed or disturbed. Eating habits. Everybody knows about stress and eating for comfort. That would be one example. And then that goes into the chemistry of our bodies. And that gets out of sync. So the nervous system ends up sort of working at odds with the cardiovascular, with the breathing, and with the metabolic cycles in our body. And the craniosacral therapist, tuning into that underlying tidal flow, can usually pick out where it can't synchronize, and how it can't synchronize. And having treatment, we'll get clues as to how it may be promoted and developed to help resynchronize the body, which will then start to affect your posture, your breathing, your heart rate, your sleeping patterns, your thirst, your wakefulness, and so on in your daily life. We would say cranially that children, for example, who are in a state of shock tend to be depleted and to have insufficient pressure. For example, blood pressure, cold hands and feet, very weak breathing. And the cranial rhythm itself will be kind of shallow. The tide will be quite sort of shallow. It still may have the same period, but it'll be quite shallow with not much power in it. It's almost as if there's a sense where the body is sort of giving up. And in the chronic alarmed child, the kind of aggressive little kid that's almost destined to be a bully at school or is very hurtful and on that hair trigger that I mentioned, that child will tend to be inflated. So the cranial rhythm will be very, very strong and rapid, and the blood pressure will be high, the heart will beat, hypertension, for example, in older people, carrying that alarm through life, hypertension, heart disease, etc., etc. And the breathing pattern will be held and full. So we say that the shocked little child will be turned in, self-protected, and breathing very weakly, sort of breathing off the bottom, as it were, not able to fill the lungs. The asthmatic child will be unable to take in a full breath. Whereas on the other hand, the alarmed, hypertensive child will be breathing off the top. They will be inflated all the time and not able to let go of a breath. So they will have the alarm type asthma, you see. And so all the different kinds of things we're seeing in our children, asthmatic patterns, patterns of rash, patterns of indigestion, bowel problems, eyesight problems, hearing, learning disorders, and so on, speech problems, all we can quite often find a root in how they have embodied their trauma. And using the cranial rhythm, we can often get underneath it. When a practitioner holds you cranially, the two of you may entrain. So it's like having two oceans coming together, like at Cape Town, having the power of two oceans in training both bodies. And this can also apply to group work. And it certainly applies to touch, generally. When two people like each other, they naturally touch. They jump in each other's arms. They hold each other. They stroke each other. And this is a kind of a natural way that we entrain with each other. We feel that the chemistry is right. And literally it is. So falling in love, for example, is an entrainment. And we know what that does for our health. It's one of the best things you can do for chronic illness is to fall in love. Amazing how things disappear.